Welcome to Take the Lead Radio with Dr. Diane Hamilton, where she interviews some of the most successful leaders, entrepreneurs, authors, speakers, and other individuals who will inspire you to take the lead in your career and personal life. And now, here is Dr. Diane Hamilton.
I am here with Doug Conant, who's an internationally renowned business leader, New York Times best-selling author, keynote speaker, and social media influencer with over 40 years of leadership experience at world-class global companies. For the past 20 years of his leadership journey, he's honed his leadership craft at the most senior levels, first as president of Nabisco Foods Company, then as CEO of Campbell Soup Company, and finally as chairman of Avon Products. In 2011, he founded Conant Leadership, a mission-driven community of leaders and learners who are championing leadership that works in the 21st century. He is the co-author of the best-selling Touchpoints, Creating Powerful Leadership Connections in the Smallest of Moments, and has been listed as one of the top 100 most influential authors in the world. Wow, that's quite a lot to say, and you've done a lot. It's so nice to have you here, Doug.
I'm sort of like a Timex watch. I take a licking and keep on ticking.
Well, I tell you, I told you before we started the show, every business class I've ever taught, you're listed in it. I mean, your case study's a fascinating one, and I'm sure anybody who's ever taken a business course has heard of how you turned Campbell Soup around. I'd like to can you just give a little background of what you did prior to joining Campbell's?
Well, I was actually recruited into Nabisco back in the 90s, right after Barbarians at the Gate, when KKR acquired RJR Nabisco in the world's largest LBO. And at that point in time, in 1990-91, that large private equity acquisition led to chaos within the company, as a lot of the executives had left, and they were rebuilding the company to ultimately put it back on the market again. And so I went in at the early stages there, and it's been a decade laboring with a lot of amazing people at Nabisco to turn that around. And we ultimately sold it to my former company, Kraft, at which point I took a week off, and then I started as CEO of Campbell Soup Company.
Well, your experience with Campbell's is what probably got you the most attention and everything that I've seen. And I'm curious if you think that some of these stories have been exaggerated. I mean, did you really write 30,000 handwritten notes? I mean, what's the right? I've heard different numbers. So,
well, I didn't count, but for the record. But when I was retiring, I became renowned for handwriting notes to people who had made significant contributions to the company, and trying to get those notes handwritten on paper to people within 24 hours of when I was advised of what they did. And when I was retiring after almost 11 years, someone said, "How many notes did you actually write?" So we went back and did the math. Mm-hmm. And because I wrote 10 to 20 a day, 6 days a week religiously, 52 weeks a year. Wow. And so we did the math, and at a minimum, it was 30,000 notes to Campbell employees. I believe it felt like more. And but we only had 20,000 employees. So virtually everybody in the company had a note or two from me. And that includes executive assistants and receptionists that was pinned in their cubicle or by their desk somewhere, acknowledging something they had done to help us move the company forward. See, I powerfully believe that when people say it's not personal, it's just business, that's bullshit.
Yeah. Right.
It's very personal. Any organization or any individual that ever really wanted to accomplish something meaningful, believe me, they were personally invested in it. And so we celebrated personal contributions at Campbell, and it was not a large part, but a small part of the way we built just amazing employee engagement over the decade I was there. And by the way, they're doing even better now. Under the leadership of Denise. Well, I don't know,
Yeah.
but the leadership of Denise Morrison, who was my successor and worked
Uh-huh.
for me while I was there, the company is now on a 18-year run of
Awesome.
solid performance, which in today's world, for an old economy canned soup company, is somewhat unimaginable. And but the people there are just amazing.
Well, you know, all this boils down to engagement, which is such a huge topic right now. And you made this a huge topic years ago. Why do you think they still struggle with it so much in organizations? If we've read so much about how important it is and the ways to improve it, why isn't it getting much better?
Well, I don't know that it's not.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know the facts
Mm-hmm.
today, but I know the facts when I went through it. And you see, I just don't think you can expect anybody to be wildly engaged in the agenda of your enterprise if they don't think you're supportive of if the company is not somewhat engaged in supporting their life journey at the same time. So I believe it's sort of a quid pro quo. If you want employees engaged in your agenda, you've got to get engaged in theirs, and you've got to be supportive of them in unique and special ways.
Mm-hmm.
And so to me, the logic of it is inarguable. At times we lose our way because we're trying to do the expedient thing and that maybe not necessarily the right thing for the long term. And at times that gets in the way. But I see companies today that are building wonderful levels of engagement.
Right.
I started doing this in 2001 with the Gallup organization when it was new.
Mm-hmm.
And we tracked it religiously for 11 years and really saw a profound impact. So I know paying attention to this works, but I do suspect that it's now passé. It's now, when I started, it's now 17 years later, and I'm sure there's a new widget or a new shiny idea that's fresher. But to me, employee engagement is really at the heart of what any leader needs to promote in order to drive excellent performance in an enduring way.
Right. Well, I'm thinking of experiences I've had. I worked in a company where all the leaders sat on the top floor and never came down, and no one was allowed up there. And there was just a real problem with engagement in that company. And I know you work with helping people understand engagement. I mean, how do you begin to fix issues like that?
Well, it's got to work on the head and the heart level. And first of all, I think you can create a case. One can create a case that employee engagement is mission critical for an organization, both just on a logic level. And you want them engaged in your mission, you better be engaged to some degree in theirs. And by the way, it's even more important now because the workforce that we're moving into, who the leaders of tomorrow,
Right.
the Gen Xers and the millennials, they have a much more collaborative leadership model.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you don't have a choice anymore in terms of being
Right.
being engaged. If you're not engaged, they're not going to get engaged. I guarantee it.
Right.
So I think this is even a more timely subject now. But what I observe is organizations that cling to old models, which don't work anymore, and I would talk about that within the context of hierarchy and the traditional models that I started with when I started working in 1975. You would write a recommendation, it would go up the chain of command. A week later, you'd look for the white smoke to come out of the chimney to tell you whether it was a good idea or not. And then you would redo it 3 times, and ultimately a month later, you would have a decision. Today, we have to make decisions on demand. Information
Right.
decision making is moving at the speed of light. Hierarchies are crumbling under that pressure now. And so I found as a CEO in the first decade of the 21st century that you had to let go and you had to empower more people to make decisions on demand to meet the needs of their internal and external customers. And so you couldn't control things anymore. The broader employee population had to control things. They had to be engaged. They had to think on their feet. They had to represent you properly. And the only way you could create those conditions, I found, was by engaging them in a way that motivated them to represent the company to the very best of their ability on demand. And in order to do that, they have to be with you. And as I talk to CEOs today, the reality is that in any organization, 1,000 decisions are made every hour, over 1,000, but let's say 1,000. 999 of those decisions are made when you're not in the room. And by the time they are reimagined and explained to you, they'll make perfect sense. But the reality is, you have the ability to guide an organization in a direction. You don't have the ability to run it. And you have to recognize that. And then you have to find a way to connect with the broader organizations so that they'll represent your company with distinction. They'll only represent your company with distinction if they feel they're treated with distinction by the leadership of the company. That's my observation. I've seen it time and again in work and since I have retired from the corporate world.
It's interesting to talk about whether people, you get people really engaged and interested in what they're doing and what you're, just on talking to them and all that. Do you ever find that people are just misaligned? Is that the problem with some of the disengagement? Is just they're just in a job that maybe is not good for them? They need to move to do something else?
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think, sadly, people don't really look. People are overwhelmed. My one observation with leaders today, more so than when I started, is that they feel as if they're trying to get a sip of water from the fire hydrant of life every minute. Stuff is just washing over them, both from a business perspective, a customer perspective, an internal business perspective, a family perspective, a community perspective. Look, they're swamped. And so they're having trouble orchestrating an effective leadership life. And so in that process, they tend to lose themselves, and they're just trying to keep their head above water. As a result, they really don't know what they're suited for. One of the things I advocate, and we did in our Touch Points book, is that leaders have to carve out time for reflection, and they really have to start acting with more intention. When I started my career, basically management, most of the leaders I worked for and observed, they led by the seat of their pants. Mm-hmm. And you could sort of do it because there was a way to do it at that time. The hierarchies were fundamentally working following World War II, and you sort of knew the rules of the road. Today, in what they call, my friends at Harvard call the VUCA world, volatile, uncertain, complex, and VUCA, and ambiguous. Mm-hmm. You can't act. You can't necessarily be affected by the seat of your pants every moment. You have to be much more intentional. And to become more intentional as a leader, I think you have to reflect on the leader you want to be, and then you have to put in place a process that helps you behave more the way you want to be behaving than you might have been doing otherwise if you were just managing by the seat of your pants. And as leaders go through that process, we teach it at our boot camp and also at a nonprofit I work with in Boston. As they start to think about the leader they want to be, they begin to become enlightened on the way they want to approach that part of their life. And they start to migrate to areas of interest where they feel they can be helpful, and it may not be in the area of interest that they're operating in today. They do need to step back and reflect.
Right. Well, your boot camp, I'm curious, what do you get? You mentioned millennials and Gen Xers, and who traditionally attends your boot camp? Do you get different age groups in that?
Well, occasionally, but we really are focusing on, we're very selective because the way we do boot camp requires us to be selective. We only take 24 to 32 at a time. We have an intense 2 days with an intense amount of work before they get there and then work after they leave. But we tend to focus on senior middle managers and C-suite executives who probably have 10 to 20 years on the runway for the rest of their career. Mm-hmm. They hunger to do better and to lead more effectively, but they're not quite sure how. And so our sweet spot with boot camp is senior middle managers to executives. We're working on a book right now, which will hopefully be out in 2019, which will make this conversation very approachable to anyone. But right now, I do a very hands-on. I teach this thing by myself, and I do it 3 to 4 times a year, and that's the focus of the boot camp now. But with luck, the book will be out next year, and it'll be more approachable for everyone. There is a way to do this, and you don't have to turn your life upside down in order to do it. And by the way, the amazing thing these leaders discover is, leading can be fun. We can there can be joy in work. Mm-hmm. You can be working against the agenda of the company, representing your people well, enjoying the challenges, not every minute, but on balance, enjoying the challenges. Right. And you can have greater impact. But we do have to change the way we think about it in order to get there.
Do you focus at all on the different generations? Do you get a lot of questions about millennials and younger generations and how to reach them?
Yes, but what I find is employee engagement, when you think about engagement, which I really don't spend a lot of time on in the boot camp, but if you think about employee engagement, you're trying to reach, the concept is that you're honoring the agenda of the individual and trying to inspire them to honor the agenda of the company. If you're honoring the agenda of the individual, you are by nature speaking to every person, every generation, every diversity person, every gender. And so the nature of employee engagement is all about honoring the agenda of the individual. And you honor the millennial, you honor the Gen Xer. In order to do that, you have to be tuned into what they're looking for. Right. And but the concept of employee engagement is all about how you connect with the individual in their circumstance. And there are some timeless principles that can be applied to that process. Gallup's done a great job with their Q12 survey, and other organizations have developed very rich survey tools that in 10 to 20 questions, you can be tapping into the interests of each individual and then shaping an agenda that honors those interests.
Right. I've seen a lot of people test and get a baseline and then do nothing with the results.
Well, you got to be a dog on a bone with this work. Yeah. We did it for 12 years while I was there, a baseline, and then 11 years subsequent. And the survey itself is not the secret. Mm-hmm. The secret is what you do with the results. We would do the survey with thousands of employees, but then we would share the survey results with about 600 different work groups. All the employees, not some of them, but all of them. Right. And those employees would assess the results from their group, see how they compared to other groups in the company, and see how they compared with the company overall. And also they could see how they compared to other like-minded companies. And then they would figure out, well, what do we need to do this coming year to be more helpful to our associates? And they would pick 3 things, and then they would have a work plan that would remediate those 3 things. And over the course of a decade, each work group was basically remediating or addressing 30 different things that were going on in their group, and in a continuous improvement way. And everyone knew that every year we were going to be revisiting how we did. and I guess just a small note is we actually added a question as we did the survey. We said, how effective has your manager been in helping you remediate these issues? And as soon as we started surveying the employees about how their manager was doing, it was amazing how much more engaged the managers got.
Yeah.
And I saw all the results. I saw the results for 600 work groups. I was in communication with the top 350 leaders on how they were doing. It was a real center of the plate activity for me.
Well, that's
but you have to be a dog on a bone.
Mm-hmm.
There's just no other. If you're not championing a process of continuous improvement, think of this as Six Sigma for culture building.
Right.
And if you're not championing a process and performance, then it will drift and it will fall by the wayside. So you do have to be a dog on a bone.
Well, a lot of it you want to follow through, right, and give feedback, and all the things that we hear about are important for getting people more engaged in work. And it led to my interest in curiosity and how much curiosity plays into whether people are successful. And they want to know more about how well they're doing. They want feedback. They want to have opportunities for growth. How can you develop a sense of curiosity in people? And how has curiosity impacted your success?
Well, I think Jim Collins did. I continue to think Jim Collins did some really great work, not just in his Good to Great book, but in his as he looked at leaders of good to great companies, and he talked about level 5 leaders. Which were the ones he held in the highest esteem. He noted they had 2 noticeable characteristics that differentiated them. A, they had a fierce resolve to move things forward that sort of transcended the ordinary. Mm-hmm. And B, they had a remarkable sense of humility. So, because the one thing they knew is they didn't know enough. and they knew they wanted to move the organization forward. So you put those 2 things together, and those leaders were remarkably curious. Mm-hmm. Well, how can we do better? This is how much I know, but all together, maybe how can we make this work even better? And as those leaders and as leaders I've worked with, as I've seen them contribute, I see this sense of fierce resolve married to a sense of humility, to a point where they're modeling and they're asking questions. They're modeling curiosity. And how are we going to do this? We've got to go from here to here. That it's not clear how we're going to get there. What do we need to do differently? How do we need to think about this? So in that kind of a culture, curiosity is important. The other thing I would say about curiosity is it has to be given room to breathe and surface. Mm-hmm. And the one thing I talk about at my website at conantleadership.com is the single most important thing I think you can do as a leader is inspire trust in the organization. And because if you don't have a high trust culture, people are not likely to express their curiosity and to advance it. So it's awfully important to promote trust. And I talk about it on the website a lot, but those 30,000 notes to employees had a benefit in that they knew I was paying attention, they knew I valued them, and in the fullness of time, it created a level of trust and engagement that was second to none in the Fortune 500. And there were a host of other activities that signaled, we value you, we trust your judgment. And as we built trust, curiosity had room to breathe, candor had room to breathe, and we were able to constructively move the enterprise forward in a way that I felt was alive and vital.
Well, do you think that all people have that innate curiosity? I mean, if we give them the room to ask questions and all that, do you think that it comes naturally to do that, or do we have to develop that in people?
I don't know the answer to
That's
that,
a tough one, isn't it?
But yeah, it is. But I would say all groups have the potential to be curious. I don't know about individuals. I think the magic is in the group.
So I know you're an advocate of teams,
and creating a way to tap into the chemistry of the group so that curiosity can bloom.
Maybe be contagious, huh?
Yeah. But I think any group I've been with, we could. I've never used these words before, but we could create the conditions for curiosity to thrive. And not just curiosity, candor and curiosity, so that people are looking at the real world, what's really going on, not what people want to have going on, and then are smartly exploring ways to address things. So I think curiosity, when you're talking about an enterprise or an institution, it's more about, can you promote curiosity within the enterprise, within the institution? And I think you can do that anywhere this side of the USSR or Russia, maybe, and China.
Okay.
But in terms of free enterprise, I don't know a free enterprise organization that can't champion a culture that is curious.
Well, so where did you get this desire to improve culture? I mean, you've had a lot of successes, and it seems to have come naturally to you. I mean, I think, did I hear you say you were fired from General Mills early on?
Well, I didn't say that, but I was.
No, I mean, I read it somewhere.
I mean, I've talked about that pretty openly.
Right.
I was let go from General Mills, and it was probably the darkest day I had after working for the company for 10 years, a company I loved. But I was just in the wrong place at the wrong time and not doing well enough.
What made you forge ahead after that? I mean, a lot of people would have
quite frankly, I was devastated. It was the most devastating day of my life. I can remember it as if it was yesterday. I drove to work. It was the fall. The receptionist at the front desk said, "Larry would like to see you in his office." He was the acting senior vice president of marketing for our company. I was working in a subsidiary, Parker Brothers Toys and Games, actually in Boston. And I went up to Larry's office, and Larry couldn't look at me, and I thought, this isn't good.
Yeah.
And he said, "Doug, your job has been eliminated. You need to be out of here by noon." Oh. And 9+ years of my career was over in a snap. And I was packing up and leaving that day. That was devastating. I ended up with an outplacement counselor who said, "You've got to be distinctive as you go out into the marketplace," which was very hard for me. Another conversation, because I'm an introvert, and I wasn't good at presenting myself. He said, "You're going to be a terrible interview, but we've got to think through a way for you to navigate this." And ultimately, we landed on a process where I would handwrite a thank you note to everybody I met, including receptionists and executive assistants, wherever I interviewed. And they would get it within 24 hours. And this is when we only had snail mail.
Right.
And so I would go for an interview, and then I would go to the coffee shop next door. I would get all the names, and I would handwrite notes to everybody. I'd take them back to the place, and I'd hand them to the receptionist and ask them to be delivered that day. And I did that throughout my job search process, and ultimately it found its way into the way I led, which was just connecting with people in a way that an introvert could connect with people, which was through notes. And but that was a very arduous process, very hard for an introvert to go looking for a job. At that point, it was 1984, and you didn't talk about being fired the way you can talk about leaving a company today.
Right.
It was hard, and I was out of work for a year.
That's a long time, yeah.
Well, it was when you have a wife, 2 small kids, and a very large mortgage. But anyway, I navigated through that.
So you got the handwriting note thing. Do you think it originated there to learn how to do it later?
It's pretty funny, because I was giving a speech at my mother's retirement community a few years ago. My mother is now 90, she'll be 92, February 27th. And they asked me to come speak to their group. and so the people that ran the facility. So I went and spoke, and my mother was there, and I'm talking about the importance of thank you notes, and my mother interrupted the whole presentation to say, I spent 25 years trying to get you to write thank you notes. And
that's so funny.
I wasn't very good then either. But when when the student is ready, the teacher appears.
That's funny.
And my outplacement counselor appeared, but he was only teaching me something that my mother had spent 25 years laying the groundwork for.
That's great. Well, you think about on the introvert extrovert thing that introverts often say they wish they had thought of saying something they didn't have time to think about, and then extroverts often say things they wish they hadn't said. I could see that writing notes would be good for both cases. You don't put in the stuff you shouldn't have said, and you do include the stuff you should have said, don't you think?
Well, on balance, I think that makes sense. It worked for me because I wanted to be thoughtful about what I said, and I wanted to say it from the heart too, and I wanted to do that properly. So, that's what worked for me. It doesn't work for everybody, but interestingly, Susan Cain has become a good friend, the author of Quiet.
Yeah,
and when I first met Susan, it was funny. I've taken the Myers-Briggs test 5 times, and every time I've wanted to be an extrovert. If you're an introvert, you want to be an extrovert. and all 5 times I was an introvert. Not a flaming introvert, but an introvert. And it was only after the 5th time, and I'm a CEO at Campbell, that I realized all I needed to do was to come out of the closet with people that I was an introvert. I was trying to act the role of being the extrovert CEO,
right.
And it was exhausting.
I'll bet.
So I finally just, I told people, by the way, I'm an introvert. If you see me standing off to the side, looking like I'm not in tune, don't feel as if I'm acting aloof. Just look at me and say, "There's Doug again. He's feeling uncomfortable. He doesn't know what to say, so he's standing off to the side." And just come up to me and say, "Are you feeling a little introverted right now?" And the answer will be yes.
Yeah.
And so I just started talking about it, and very openly, and it was so freeing. It was unbelievable how it transformed kind of my ability to show up more authentically with people, And if I wasn't saying anything, they weren't assuming the worst.
Right.
It transformed my life. So coming out of the closet, quote unquote, on your introversion is something I have highly recommended to many of my introvert friends.
Yeah, well, Susan's book is just an amazing book, and I interviewed Ken Fisher, and that Fisher Investments, and he's obviously a very successful billionaire that's amazingly successful, and he was talking about how that book had a real strong impact on him as well because he's an introvert, and it helped him. I mean, how did you get to know Susan?
Well, we became friends. She tends to talk about. She read the thing she was fascinated by was my 30,000 notes, and she had read my book, and I have a process that helps introverts kind of express themselves, and she was fascinated with that. So we met very early on when her book was being published, and I'm on her advisory board, and I've known her for a long time. She really tapped into something that's so powerful. I think the most untapped potential in most organizations is the workforce you already have, and typically the processes you have in an organization work more for extroverts than for introverts, and you have to find a way to tap into the full potential of introverts to contribute. And I think she's onto a big idea that we're just beginning to feel our way through.
Well, she was great. I saw her speak at a Work Human event last year, and I'm interested in your process, though. What's your process to help introverts express themselves?
Well, I didn't do it. It's in my Touch Points book, and it's part of my boot camp process. But fundamentally, it's called declaring yourself, and I talk about it on my website too. But the notion is that people are not mind readers. We tend to think people are going to understand where we're coming from without explaining it to them.
Mm-hmm.
And people are, as I said earlier, people are swamped. Everybody feels as if they're taking a sip of water from the fire hydrant of life.
Right.
And so they're not tuned into how you're thinking.
Right.
Who are you kidding?
Uh-huh.
They're having 400 interactions a day. And, they're just not tuned in. So I think as a leader or as a contributor, as a colleague, you need to tell people where you're coming from and what you're thinking. And for an introvert, for me, that was hard.
Right.
So I created a process where the first hour of the first day I worked with somebody, I would walk them through, here's who I am, here's what I stand for, here's how I think, and I just want to make this work. And my goal is to take the mystery out of our relationship as quickly as possible so that we can focus on moving our organization forward. And I did that for probably the last 20 years of my career, certainly the last 15. And I would do that with individuals with whom I worked and with organizations with whom I worked. First hour, first day. And then I would have a steady drumbeat of doing what I would tell them that first hour I was going to do. And my belief was, if I do what I say I'm going to do, I guess you can trust me and we can move forward. If I don't, at least you'll know, and we can and you can make your judgments accordingly. But I found that by declaring myself, telling people how I thought and that I was an introvert and this is how I tend to do things, that it got the relationship off on better footing. Mm-hmm. I would always invite the individual to come back and share with me over another half hour where they're coming from. And so that the two of us could kind of build a relationship that was thoughtful and that was based on a better understanding of each other. I work for people, and I'm sure you have too, that, you're doing this dance for like months trying to figure out, well, what does she really want and how should I really do it? And that's just a waste of time.
Yeah.
So I just tried to clear all that stuff out first hour, first day. Didn't get it all, but I got a lot of it. And I tended to be on firmer footing with the people with whom I worked. Mm-hmm. I'll give you one quick example.
Oh, sure.
I hired this fellow to run the food service organization for Nabisco, and talented guy. And I'm sharing with him first hour, first day he started working. He said, "This is great, Doug. Thank you. Normally I wouldn't bring this up because I talk about my family and how important it is to me, and as well as my work and my community and my faith. So I cover all that stuff." And he says, "Well, I'm so glad you did that. One thing I didn't get into when we were going through the interviewing process is I'm recently divorced, and part of my excitement about this job is I'm going to be able to be back on the East Coast and live near my kids, my two sons, and I want to stay close to them as we go through this process. And normally I wouldn't be sharing this with you the first hour of the first day, but given that it's come up, I hope we can make something work." And on the spot, I was able to commit to him that, we'll do whatever it takes to make that work for you. And from that day on, he did whatever it took to make it work for the company. Mm-hmm. We never would have had that discussion if I hadn't kicked it off with this declaring yourself exercise.
Right.
And it just wouldn't have happened. And he would have been trying to jerry-rig his life to be at all the meetings and to do all this stuff that he thought was necessary in order to placate me. Mm-hmm. And all he had to do is, my son's got a basketball game.
Right.
Can we make it work another way? And we could. It was just so much easier and genuine. So this declaring yourself process, I highly recommend.
Well, you get a win-win, and I noticed you like Stephen Covey's information and a few things that you've had interviews where you've mentioned it. So you tend to list things like begin with end in mind, win-wins, those type of things. Is there any other author other than Covey and Susan Cain that really has influenced you?
Oh, well, a ton of them. But Stephen Covey was another one who became a mentor and a friend until he sadly passed away. His son is a very good friend of mine now, Stephen M.R. Covey, who is the foremost writer on trust building in the United States, if not the world. So, but Stephen had a profound influence on me. Warren Bennis had a big influence on me as well. And in fact, he wrote the foreword to our book, my book Touch Points. Ram Charan was my professor in graduate school, and has been a friend now for a long time, for over 40 years. And Ram had a profound influence on me. Back in my day, I was reading, 3 books on what I would call wisdom literature, which weren't just necessarily business, but were books that promoted wisdom. Anything from Joseph Campbell to Ram Charan. I was reading 2 or 3 books a week. Introverts read.
Right.
And and when I was at Campbell, I was commuting 2 to 2.5 hours each way, 4 to 5 hours a day, every day for 10 years. And fortunately, I can read in a car. So
it's hard.
So I've read a lot, and I would bet that I can't bet anymore. I'm so active with social media that I'm not reading as much. But I would bet I'm in the top 5% of all Fortune 500 CEOs and chairmen in terms of reading. I love to learn. I love to read. I love to stay current with thinking. It's very stimulating.
Well, you're developing your curiosity, and I love that for
There you go.
We're back full circle with that, and I think it's it's so important to share that love of learning with everybody, and I always wonder how what leaders do to share that with their followers in terms of do they have book requests, like, why don't we everybody try and read this? I've had leaders do that, say, why don't we read these 2 books, and and some of them have been great.
I can tell you, I have thousands of books in my office still, and whenever I have a guest, I give a book to them that makes sense for them. So I'm always giving books. I'm always giving books away, and I started doing, when we were turning around Nabisco, I started a book of the month club, and these books just piled up in my executives' offices. They were just overwhelmed by it.
Yeah.
And so then I went to a book of the quarter club, which was more manageable and more selective and still sending the same signal. And then I went to a book of the quarter club where I just said, if you don't have time to read the whole book, read these 3 chapters.
Oh, that's a good idea.
And I think that got the most traction, because not everybody is a reader. So today, if I was doing it, I would be, which I do for my boot camp, I would be, and for some of the other places I teach, I would be doing podcasts and things as well, and video. I would have them looking at TED Talks and things. There's some amazing TED Talks from Clayton Christensen and David Brooks and a host of other people that today I would use. I think in boot camp, and I'm pretty sure in Touch Points, I always talk about, it's a grow or die world. The corporate world is grow or die. And either you're learning and growing or you're not. There's no in between. So I always say I'm promoting learning and growing. It beats the alternative. And so from the get-go, wherever I am, we're promoting learning and growing.
Well, that's awesome. And you definitely deserve the recognition you received. And it's amazing how many people I've talked to that just rant and rave about the successes you've had. And
well, we've got them fooled. They don't know me well enough.
I know. Yeah, you really have done some amazing things. And you've gone from completely different organizations too. I mean, Avon's got to be a little bit different than Campbell Soup, and how is that changing completely different type of industries? Is it the same thing?
No, it was challenging, and basically, in my 40-year career, I spent a decade at each of three, a decade with General Mills, a decade or 7 years with Kraft, a decade with Nabisco, and a decade with Campbell. And then I was only chairman of Avon Products for 3 years because we had a very difficult situation that ultimately required that we break up the company. But so I was with companies for a decade, basically a decade at a time. Avon was the biggest challenge because I was hired the day before they hired a new CEO. And then within 6 months, for a variety of reasons, I all of a sudden became chairman. And the company was struggling. We did the best we could. We ultimately had to break it up, which was the last thing we wanted to do, but there was no other strategic alternative that we could find. And we were running out of time. So, but in all, the common element across all this, and whenever I do leadership talks, this is all about the people.
Right.
It's all about the culture that you build. And building a high performance culture should be job one for any executive. And it's not about you, it's about them. And it's about how they show up when you're not in the room. And you have to create the conditions for that. And whether it's Avon or Campbell, which was an unusual company, or the world's largest LBO, Nabisco, or the company I started with, General Mills or Kraft, the common element was people who all wanted to make it work. And the challenge for any leader is to find the key that'll make it work for them in a way that makes it work for the company. And there's always a way. There's always a way. When I took over Campbell Soup, we were a canned soup company. We were making the same products 100 years later that we had made in the 1800s. We were headquartered in the poorest, most dangerous city in the United States, Camden, New Jersey. 75,000 people, 70 murders a year. Our facility was surrounded by razor wire so that employees felt safe. They also felt like they were going into the prison every day to go to work. And we were on death's doorstep. If we could change that culture to a place where now Denise Morrison is taking it to unforeseen heights, if we could do it, anybody could do it.
Right. That's amazing. And you really have the background and experience that I hope a lot of people listen to this show and go to your site to find out more from what you're doing now with your Conant leadership and your new book that I guess next year you said is coming out, and your totally very successful bestseller, Touch Points. And I think a lot of people want to find out how they could learn more about you, Doug, and how to get your information. What can you share some of your websites or contact information?
If they go to conantleadership.com, they can learn all about how to contact us and everything else. One thing I'd say about Conant Leadership is we are in this to champion leadership that works in the 21st century. We don't make any money. We cover our costs. I don't take a salary.
That's awesome.
I charge for speaking events. I charge for some teaching. Most teaching I don't charge for. And all we're doing is covering our costs. If we make any money in a given year, we give it away. We're a small operation, but in the first 4 years we've given away, we just went over $1 million of philanthropy on July 4th of this past year.
Wow, congratulations.
So we're in this work for all the right reasons, just to try and be helpful.
That's awesome.
It's fulfilling work. There's no other agenda. If we can't be helpful, people shouldn't waste their time with us. We are getting great traction with our social media, Twitter. They can find me on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, as well as the website. But if they go to the website, they can get all that information. ConantLeadership.com.
Yeah. Well, that's awesome. Thank you so much for being on the show, Doug. This has been so fascinating. I've been really looking forward to this.